Water is the reason Milwaukee is where it is. Our lakes and rivers provided a means for transportation, for settlement. There have been many changes over 150 years, but much about the port remains the same.
The Milwaukee port is very important to the city of Milwaukee. It was important at the time of its founding. It was important throughout the development of the city of Milwaukee, and it's certainly important today. And the reason that we are is because that we act as a private business would do to provide economic development for the city.
The port director talked about its history recently for a County Historical Society gathering, a history that begins before Milwaukee became a city.
Milwaukee's origins as a real commercial port date to about 1835, when the first commercial vessel called at what was then a very struggling community on the western shore of Lake Michigan.
A port system was developed along the banks of the rivers, but even then, city officials realized a river-based port would not be adequate to serve the needs of a growing city.
Already in the 1840s, ships started to accumulate. And the reason they did is that starting in the 1840s, Milwaukee started to be a very, very large grain export area. By the 1860s, indeed, Milwaukee was the largest grain exporting port in the world. What you're seeing is what I talked about earlier on, and that is a very burgeoning, a very developed riverfront type of port operation. This is the Milwaukee River. Many of the buildings that you'll see as we go along today are still in existence today. But not only did the river system and the port handle cargo at this time, we're starting to see a very definite tilt toward the handling of passengers. And because of our rising status as an exporting area, we started to look at harbor improvements. We're now at a point in time where we're just kind of at the turn of the century, and frankly, the shipping within the river system is getting intolerable from a couple of reasons. One is just the sheer volume. We now have segued away from being a grain port. We shifted over towards being one of the largest coal ports. You can imagine the congestion, but then there was another reason to really start getting serious about moving the port. The bridges. Bridges going up, bridges going down. Commerce needs to move, people needs to move, and what are we doing? We're opening and closing bridges.
And so city officials looked to Jones Island, at the time a large fishing community. Starting around 1900, they recommended a series of docks in the outer harbor area, and the residents were displaced. All were gone by the late 1930s.
Around 1926, then, the real development of Jones Island got underway. What they did is they dug out that big marsh area that I showed you back in 1936. That marsh area was dug, and that fill was placed, along with a lot of other stuff, foundry sands and what have you, into Jones Island. And that work pretty much continued throughout the late 20s and into the 30s. And here we've got a shot of really a developed Jones Island from the late 40s or early 50s. The fact that we can tie into the inland river system, the fact that we have the lake and international vessel traffic coming back and forth, and can marry those to the U.S. highway system and the rail system is what makes the Port of Milwaukee today.
While the Great Lakes fleet is much smaller than it once was, the port still provides jobs for about 1,500 people. Many are minority residents of the city.
And it seems like we don't have a lot of ships, okay? But we have as much tonnage as we ever did. We have a container yard where much of the general cargo that used to be loaded piecemeal, box by box, now moves on containers.
Zali says the port is one place where it could be said the more things change, the more they stay the same.
You may have been reading lately of our efforts to reinstitute a ferry operation here in Milwaukee. and also our efforts to bring cruise ships back to the Great Lakes, and we've been successful in doing that. And so what was once old is now again becoming new, and that's a constant theme, but we have a vibrant port because we've embraced change, and we've worked very hard to be as efficient as we can be. The port has been in the past and still remains today a very important piece of economy.
Call 911 in Milwaukee and you may get a fire engine with emergency medical technicians. You may get a fire department ambulance with more highly trained paramedics. If your emergency is not life-threatening and needs basic, not advanced life support, a private ambulance will be called.
The important thing wherever you live is to be able to pick up a phone and know that emergency services are going to come to your door, they're going to get there fast, they're going to have the appropriate training, that you won't be robbed in terms of the fee, and that you'll get high-quality care from the point of the emergency to wherever it is that you're going. Putting that system together is a lot more complicated than most people want to know about behind the scenes.
For about the last 20 years, private ambulance companies have been an important part of Milwaukee's emergency delivery system. A little known but important group regulates them, the Ambulance Service Board. Dr. Foldy is a member.
To allow private companies to get involved in the system, you have to have a carefully constructed, well-regulated system. You have to know that they will respond within a reasonable time period. You need to know that their care protocols meet the requirements set by our local medical authorities, and you want to make sure that there's some regulation of price. What the Ambulance Service Board does on an every 5-year basis is create a service plan for what are called the basic life support services. When you call the 911, you think it's a life-threatening emergency, and if somebody checks it out, and in fact you can take a slightly slower boat to the hospital, then the private ambulance company that is covering that sector of the city can come in and get you to where you need to go.
As chairman of the Common Council's Public Safety Committee, Alderman Michael Murphy is also a member of the Ambulance Service Board.
You know, most people would probably assume that it's a free marketplace. You know, anybody can come and pick you up. Doesn't matter. The reality is government has a responsibility, and one of the key things is trying to make sure that those type of services are provided to the public in the most safest way, in terms of the best type of response times, making sure that the equipment is at the highest level. And the city of Milwaukee, through its decision of its leaders, have come to the conclusion that we want to regulate this industry. By regulating it, we set up quarters. Basically, there's 4 sections of the city of Milwaukee where there's 4 private ambulance companies. They have a service area which they are core responsible for. And the reality is that by dispatching those individuals, they can serve that area better than if they've been going cross town. That's their core area. That doesn't mean that the ambulance companies don't advertise to get business when people pick up the phone and call them directly, though. That occurs, certainly, but we want to make sure when a person is calling 911, they get the best and the fastest service possible.
So to provide fairness between the companies, we divide the city such that approximately the same number of calls are produced in each of the 4 sectors. This gives the companies a little bit of stability to know what they're planning for in terms of the number of units they have to have ready to respond in a second's notice.
When a private company is sent to an emergency by a 911 dispatcher, the charge is regulated by the city. That rate now $231.50, plus a charge of $6.49 per mile from the point of origin to destination.
I'm always shocked at how much it is personally, but that's, you know, the way we live in today's world. Medical costs are extremely going up and up and up. We do regulate it, but we base it on a lot on the medical consumer price index. In terms, we don't try and see that a scenario develops where people are gouging people. But we certainly have to make sure that the companies get paid fairly for what services they provide.
And if you think it's an emergency, please dial 911. But If, in fact, people need to call an ambulance for a non-emergency related reason, such as being transferred from a nursing home to hospital or hospital to nursing home, something like that, the private sector also makes runs as a private, non-regulated business, and that's not where the Ambulance Service Board gets involved.
There were more than 70,000 calls for ambulance service through Milwaukee's 911 system in 1998, over a third of them by private ambulance companies.
We can always do better, but overall, I think the citizens of Milwaukee are served well by the system we have in place right now. It continuously needs to be reviewed, though. It can't be one of these things where you just sit it down and forget about it, because if it does, I think then you can run into scenarios where people are going to be very angry, and in fact, lives will be lost. So, although it may be a boring committee, I think it does have a very important role in the public health of the citizens of Milwaukee.
Ambulance services are knit together in this very rational way, so that, because the goal of the Ambulance Service Board is to make sure that if you're anywhere in the city of Milwaukee, you can expect a reasonable response time and the same quality of care and a predictable price wherever you live. And yes, so we're very proud of our system.
There are more than 20,000 children in licensed and approved group and family daycare settings in the city of Milwaukee. Nearly 280 locations with 9 or more children, another 260 with 4 to 8 youngsters. The need for additional locations continues to grow, and the city has a number of concerns over the neighborhoods where they are proposed.
It's a business that is growing and booming, and some people say that it's too easy to get into and not regulated enough. That's not our concern. Our concern isn't how the state regulates it. It's a land use issue, but because it affects neighborhoods and people, those are issues that come before the board.
The board is the Board of Zoning Appeals, a 5-member citizen group appointed by the mayor, confirmed by the Common Council. At a recent meeting, 7 of its 33 items dealt with daycare. The 7 locations were proposing care for 600 children. The state of Wisconsin is responsible for most of the regulations concerning daycare in the state, but local governments and their residents have a lot of input in several areas.
The state will work very closely with an applicant. They have a licensing specialist that they'll assign to the case, and they'll certify that there's adequate play space and room for the children and things like that. The city comes in when they apply for an occupancy permit.
In most daycare centers, it's a special use request. And for a special use, we have 4 criteria that must be met. One is protection of health, safety, and welfare. Second is protection of property. The third one is traffic and pedestrian safety concerns. And the last is, does it fit within the comprehensive plan of the city? The reason that there is the criteria fitting in to the comprehensive plan and why it deals with the zoning issue. Let's say you're in a residential neighborhood and you're all single-family homes, and your neighbor decides that he no longer wants to live in his house, that he'd like to rent it out to a daycare facility, and they want to have 100 kids in their daycare program. You, as the neighbor, might be a little upset that all of a sudden your nice residential neighborhood is now going to become a daycare center, and that's a very volatile issue.
Children and daycare issues accounted for about 200 of the cases considered by the board in 1998, nearly 30% of their workload. Whether it's an application for a new or expanding daycare facility in a new or existing building, applications must be made to the city.
An applicant's first step would be to stop in and see a plan examiner at the development center. The plan examiner would go over the requirements with them and refer them to our office. When the person had prepared all of the necessary materials, the plans and the drawings and the written statements explaining their operation, they would file that with a pre-application in our office, and that's when we would get the technical staff and the professional staff involved in reviewing the plan and the details of the proposal. We'll often make suggestions or recommendations how they could improve their submittal materials. Once that's been completed, that pre-application review, the applicant is in a position to file for the special use or the variance as need be with the board.
After plans are reviewed by the city, residents in the area of the proposed site are notified and invited to comment.
Public notice is a big part of what we do. We'll notify all the property owners in the immediate area, make sure they're apprised of the situation and the proposed development, and hold a public hearing.
If you have a very quiet street and all of a sudden that daycare center is near that street or on that street, the people are concerned about traffic. They're also concerned, very large concern has been raised about parking. Another one that's been very controversial, I think at times, and raised as an issue by our Department of Public Works Traffic Engineering is the issue of adequate drop-off. Is there a safe drop-off and pickup for the children? Every location is not appropriate location. That's what the Board of Zoning Appeals deals with all the time. People say, well, I own this building, or I could rent this building, why can't I do it? It's because we live in a city where we have rules and regulations, and we have to get along with our neighbors, and our neighbors have rights just like we do.
While the state and the city have specific areas of interest in the area of child care regulation, there can be some overlap.
For instance, somebody will come in and say to us, well, their playground doesn't meet certain criteria. Now, for the most part, that is not a concern of the Board of Zoning Appeals. That is more a concern of the state regulators. But however, if somebody comes in and says the playground isn't safe because kids could go onto the street very easily, that is a concern that the board has, and that fits within our criteria that we look at. So we look at both traffic and safety, and we look, is this something that we, for some reason, we've seen daycare centers that are on a busy thoroughfare, let's say, and if we don't believe that there's any adequate protection for traffic and pedestrian safety, it could be voted down and the special use could not be granted.
The daycare industry will be among those to benefit from new streamlined procedures before the board, according to Zetley. He adds the city's new permit and development center will do even more to simplify the application, review, and approval process. There is a high standard for board approval. 4 of the 5 members must vote in favor of the application.
So the applicant or the appellant has a very high burden of proof of showing why they should get the special use or variance. Now, in daycare centers, as in most cases, over 90-some% of the cases are approved. So people should realize that although it can be a time-consuming and detailed process, most cases get approved. And I don't think it's any different in daycare centers. The process, I think, works very well as to who should be approved and who should not.
On the rental application itself, now you can kind of follow through it if you would like. We will touch on some of the changes in the law as we go along, and I'll make sure you know what they are. On the rental application itself, the personal history, you want to make sure their name and middle initial is in there. If it's a senior or a junior, when you're doing your credit bureaus, if you don't have that correct name, you maybe don't know for sure if that's the right person. Make sure you get that date of birth, and make sure that date of birth kind of matches the person that's sitting in front of you. You really should have these applications filled out right there in front of you. The Social Security number, make sure you've got a correct Social Security number. You also need this to get a good credit bureau. If there's anybody else that's going to be in that apartment and they're over the age of 18, they must fill out an application. Can you say, well, you're married, I'll just take one application? No. Everyone over the age of 18 should fill out an application, because now you've discriminated according to familial status. When you're doing a resident history, remember the landlord you're calling to see what type of a rental person they were might be someone who says, oh, they're wonderful, because I want them out. So try to check on more than one, okay? Because you're going to get a much more honest opinion on somebody if it's the second landlord. They've already moved. So try to get that second landlord as well as the current landlord. Make sure you're asking, how long was their lease? And when did they move out? If their lease was 12 months and they moved out after 5 months, a little flag should go up, because that should tell you, well, something must have happened. Did they get kicked out? Take a seat, please. Or what really happened. And you can ask them, why did they leave? Okay? You have a right to ask certain questions. And that one long sheet, the application verification, this will help you with asking questions when you're doing the check on people. And the only other thing you've got to remember is what you do for one, you do for all. So say, for instance, you've got one person that you feel is a little shady, so now I'm going to do a lot of work on this one to see if they qualify. Can't do that. You have to do the exact same thing for everyone that applies for the apartment. Don't do anything different, because otherwise you could be in discrimination. If you've got 5 units or you've got 500 units, this type of business is a service industry. So when you're making decisions, figure out what is best for your business.
What is a credit report? What does it say about you? What doesn't it? A credit report, what it says about an individual, it's going to give your name, it's going to give your age, your social security number, how you pay your bills. It's going to list the charge cards you have. It's going to list your payment history on installment loans, mortgage loans, things like that. If you have bankruptcies, suits, judgments, tax liens, that information is also going to be included on your credit report. It's also going to show any companies who have looked into your credit within the past 90 days up to 24 months. So that's real important if a person is shopping around, say you're buying a truck, every time you shop around and give somebody your name, your social security number, and your address, you have them pull a credit report. That's going to be an inquiry into your credit. So if you shop around at 5 different places, you might have 5 people looking into your credit. You'd have 5 inquiries on your credit report. It also can include any comments you've added to your file. You as a consumer have a right to add up to 25 words onto your credit statement to explain any unusual items that might be listed there. Say, for instance, you have had a really good credit report, you lose your job, your child gets put in the hospital, you've got a lot of collections on there. They're hospital collections. You can add a consumer statement at the bottom of your credit report basically saying, I lost my job, my child was in the hospital, this is the reason for my bad credit during this time. What a credit report does not say about you, it's not going to have how much money that you have in the bank. Credit bureaus don't go to your bank and find out how much you have in your checking account or savings account or anything like that. It also doesn't say what your race is, what your religion is, what investments you have. You could be a mass murderer but have a good credit report. That will not appear on your credit report. Criminal records don't appear there. If you have arrest for drunk driving, that won't appear on there. It'll show how much you spent at a retailer, say, in a given month, but it won't say what you bought. So if you went and bought a suit of clothes, it may show $200 for a Boston store. It's not going to say it was for a suit of clothes or a gold bracelet or whatever. It's just going to say the $200. And it won't say anything about your medical history. That type of information is sealed. It is not public record. Therefore, it's not reported on your credit bureaus. To pull a credit report, all you need are the name, the social security number, and the address with a zip code. You don't need the date of birth or the age, but it helps in identifying. And the way the credit report decides if this is you or not, it's kind of like the FBI with fingerprints. It's like a 10-point system. If 8 or 9 of the characters are the same, then they're assuming that's you. In the past several years, the gas and electric company have just started to report to the bureaus. Several years ago, they would only report those people who were delinquent. Well, then they were getting sued by the people who had good credit, but they weren't reporting that. So now what they've done is they report good and bad credit. Next is how you handle a dispute with your credit report. If you've got a dispute or wrong information, erroneous information, you can get it corrected. You need to provide the same thing you do to pull a credit report. You need your full name, your current address, your social security number, your date of birth, and your home phone number so they can contact you if you have any questions. And they're going to ask you to send the information you have available if you have canceled receipts or anything like that. They're going to ask you to send that along, and they want you to explain what happened in detail as simple as possible, in as few words as possible.